They say nothing ever happens in Maple Hollow. That changed the moment Alexander Knight stepped onto my porch. I thought it was a prank when I got the booking request. Alexander Knight? The Alexander Knight? The scandal magnate. The heartthrob. The man whose face my ex used to kiss through a TV screen. I opened the door, and everything I thought I knew about him, and myself, started to fall apart. Like, share, subscribe, and drop a comment if you're already asking, what the hell was he doing in a town like mine? Because trust me, the real story starts in the next line. I rolled my eyes when I read the name on the guest request. Someone thinks they're funny, I muttered, sipping coffee on my worn-down porch swing. The wind rustled through the pines around my cottage, whispering secrets only the old evergreens knew. I shrugged it off and accepted the request anyway. Business was business, and my place hadn't been booked in over 2 weeks. Tourists usually skipped over Maple Hollow. That was the point. Then, 2 days later, someone knocked on my door. I opened it, not expecting anything other than maybe a package. And there he stood. Exhausted. Wearing a hoodie and sunglasses. Alexander Knight. In the flesh. Is this 18 Pine Ridge Lane? He asked, his voice deeper than it sounded in interviews. Realer. Rougher. Yes, I said slowly. Are you? He gave a tired smile. Still available? There was a long pause as we stood there, the door half open, the air thick with pine and disbelief. I stepped aside. Yeah. Come in. He ducked through the door frame, pulling his hoodie down and finally removing his sunglasses. My breath caught. Not just because he was him, but because up close, he didn't look like the polished magazine covers. He looked like someone trying to disappear. He looked scared. I should have known then. The quiet I clung to was about to end. Maple Hollow had always been a sleepy town. The kind of place where people knew your name and gossiped about your groceries. Where I ran a rustic Airbnb cottage and taught online photography classes from my porch. I didn't want excitement. I wanted to be left alone. But life had other plans. Alexander stayed longer than most guests. At first, he barely spoke. Said he was taking time off. I didn't push. I'd learned people came to Maple Hollow to breathe. To forget. Or to heal. It wasn't my job to ask which. But I noticed the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. How he stared out at the lake like it held answers he couldn't reach. How he barely ate unless I left something outside his door with a note that said, "Eat while it's hot." And then one night he knocked on my door. It was raining. Thunder cracked over the hills. I opened the door, and there he was, drenched, looking at me like I was the only safe place in the world. "Can I stay?" he asked. My chest tightened. "You already are." "No," he said. "With you. Just for tonight. I don't want to be alone." I stepped aside. He didn't sleep on the couch. That was the first night. The first time I let the storm inside match the one outside. The first time I let someone touch the quiet I'd buried myself in. He didn't kiss me that night. But he stayed. And that was somehow louder. That night began everything. The unraveling. The healing. The ache and the beauty of falling into someone who shouldn't have been mine to begin with. I didn't know the man at my door would rewrite my life. But he did. You can't host a man like Alexander Knight and expect to stay untouched. I tried. I really did. He stayed up all night, pacing the porch. At first, I thought it was jet lag. Or the stress of whatever reason had driven him to rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere under a fake name. But after 3 nights of hearing footsteps creak across the old boards and seeing the red flare of a cigarette through the kitchen window, I realized it was something else. Restlessness. Regret. Maybe even fear. He smoked like it was the only thing tethering him to the moment, to something real. Always the same way, shoulders hunched, one hand tucked into the pocket of his hoodie, the other lifting the cigarette to his mouth like muscle memory. I started timing my morning routine around him. The kettle would boil, the curtain would shift, and there he'd be, Alexander Knight, the most wanted man in Hollywood, standing in the pale blue morning like a ghost that hadn't yet decided if it wanted to be seen. I told myself I wasn't watching him. I told myself I didn't care. But by day 4, I knew I was lying. He hadn't said much since he arrived. We'd exchanged awkward pleasantries the first day, made small talk about the weather, about how quiet Maple Hollow was this time of year. I gave him the key, told him where to find the firewood, and kept my distance. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. But silence has weight, and is pressed down on the whole cabin like fog. That morning, I walked out onto the porch with 2 mugs in my hands, mine and one I kept convincing myself wasn't for him. He didn't turn at first. Just stared out at the lake like it had wronged him somehow. The cigarette hung between his fingers, half burnt and forgotten. "You're going to freeze out here," I said, holding out the mug. He blinked, like he'd forgotten other people existed. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since he arrived. His eyes weren't what I expected. Not movie star blue, or piercing green, or whatever the gossip blogs said. They were brown. Plain, tired, deeply human. It shook me a little. "I don't sleep much," he said quietly, taking the mug like it was a peace offering. I noticed. We stood there, side by side, not touching, not speaking. Just breathing in the same cold air. I hated how aware I was of him. His shoulders so close to mine, the faint smell of cedarwood cologne and ash. I hated how easily his presence threaded into the rhythm of my mornings. He turned slightly, his voice breaking the stillness. "You think I made a mistake coming here?" I didn't answer right away. I sipped my coffee, letting the heat anchor me. "I think you made a choice," I finally said. "We all have our reasons." He looked down at his hands, at the steam rising from the mug. I used to believe in second chances. Lately, I'm not sure they exist. I should have said something wise, something comforting. But all I could do was look at him and feel something uncoiling in my chest, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hunger. Curiosity. The ache of wanting to touch someone just to know they're real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of him. Because of me. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way his fingers trembled when he held the mug. The way he looked at the lake like it was the only thing left that didn't lie to him. I told myself I wasn't getting attached. But he was already in my bones. He was a storm I pretended was just rain. And part of me, God help me, wanted to get caught in it. It was just coffee and eggs, until it wasn't. The cabin wasn't big. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, an open kitchen that bled into the living room where the fireplace cast golden shadows across the floor. It creaked when it breathed, settled when it sighed. And that morning, it felt impossibly still. I was used to silence. I liked it, relied on it. Silence didn't ask questions. Silence didn't leave. But ever since Alexander arrived, the silence felt different, too thick, too loud, like it wanted something from us. He hadn't joined me for breakfast since he got here. Until that morning. I was halfway through scrambling eggs, trying to focus on the sizzle and not the thoughts chasing each other in my head, when I heard footsteps. I didn't turn. Just kept cooking, like I hadn't been hoping to hear that sound for days. Then came the soft scrape of a chair. And there he was. At my kitchen table. Alexander Knight. Movie star. Mystery man. The subject of thousands of late-night internet rabbit holes. Sitting at my table like it was the most natural thing in the world. He wore a black t-shirt and gray sweatpants, hair damp from a shower, barefoot. He looked real. Not glossy or perfect. Just tired. Human. "Smells good," he said, his voice low, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to speak. I slid a plate in front of him and poured 2 mugs of coffee. He looked up at me when I set one down by his hand. Not smiling. Not faking it. Thanks, Lawrence. It wasn't the first time he'd said my name. He'd used it the day he arrived. But that morning, it sounded different. Slower. Intentional. Like he tasted it before he said it. Like he needed it to land exactly right in the space between us. Lawrence. My name, suddenly not mine anymore. I sat across from him, gripping my mug like it was the only solid thing in the room. We ate in silence. Forks scraping plates. Wind brushing the windows. His knee bumped mine once, maybe an accident. I didn't move. Neither did he. So, he said eventually, what do people do in Maple Hollow when they're not hosting fugitives? Watch the lake. Lie about how boring it is. Complain about how quiet it gets, and then fight anyone who threatens to change that. He smiled. But it reached his eyes. I get it, he said. Quiet can be a kind of safety. Or a kind of prison, I said before I could stop myself. His gaze met mine. And for a second, it wasn't breakfast anymore. It wasn't quiet. It was a collision. He set down his fork, leaned back, and studied me. Not the way people look at you. The way they read you. Why do I feel like you've got your own reasons for hiding? I looked away, heat prickling the back of my neck. Do you always ask questions like that? Only when I want the answer. A beat passed. I didn't give it to him. He didn't press. Instead, he reached for his coffee, fingers wrapping around the mug, eyes still on me. Lawrence, he said again. Softer this time. Almost like a confession. And something inside me cracked open. It wasn't about who he was. Or what he'd done. It wasn't even about attraction, not just that. It was about the way he saw me. Not like a stopgap or a caretaker or a convenient local. He saw me like a person, like someone worth the effort. And maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe I was just lonely. But when he said my name like that, I felt it down to my bones. I didn't fall for Alexander Knight the actor. I fell for the man who forgot how to smile. It started after dinner, if you could call beer and leftover stew, dinner. He didn't eat much. Just pushed the food around his bowl while staring out the window like he was waiting for something to find him in the dark. You ever been lied about so thoroughly that even you start to wonder if it's true? He asked suddenly. I looked up from my bottle, startled by the crack in his voice. He didn't wait for an answer. There's this thing that happens when you're famous. People stop seeing you. They see their version of you. And the worst part? You play along. Smile for the cameras. Say the right things. Protect the image even when you're bleeding underneath. I didn't say anything. Just listened. Because I could tell he needed that more than a response. He leaned back on the couch, his hands resting on his knees, fingers twitching. The story everyone knows, it's not the truth. My ex, Julian, he said I cheated. Made it public. And fast. The press ran with it. Peer teams told me to stay quiet, let it blow over. But it never did. The silence made it worse. You didn't cheat? His eyes snapped to mine. No. He did. And when I found out, I left. I left everything. Silence settled again, but this time it felt different. Intimate. Heavy with everything unsaid. I loved him, he whispered. God, I loved him, stupid. And he burned me like I was nothing. The pain in his voice was raw, stripped of celebrity, scrubbed of control. And suddenly, I didn't see Alexander Knight, the star. I saw a man unraveling. I don't know how to come back from it, he said. I don't know how to be me anymore. Maybe you don't have to come back, I said quietly. Maybe you start from where you are. He looked at me. Really looked at me. Like I'd said something that mattered. And then he laughed. Not out of humor. It was soft. Tired. like something broken recognizing itself. "You always talk like that?" he asked. "Only when I want to be understood." He nodded, then stood and walked to the fireplace. Lit it like he needed the distraction or the warmth. Then he sat on the floor, cross-legged, back against the wall. I joined him. Close but not touching. He sighed, long and slow. "Do you know what it feels like to be touched and not believed? Kissed and still left?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because I did know. So when he looked at me, eyes red-rimmed, voice shaking, I didn't offer comfort. I offered presence. "You're not broken," I said. "You're just tired of being hurt." He didn't respond right away. Just looked into the flames like maybe they could burn away everything he didn't want to remember. Then he said, almost too quietly to hear, "No one's ever said that to me." And that was it. That was the moment. The moment I knew I couldn't stay detached. The moment I realized this wasn't just a stay at my cabin. This was the beginning of something that could ruin both of us, or save us. He was undone. Unvarnished. And I couldn't look away. I watched him sleep on my couch and I knew I was in trouble. It was supposed to be temporary. 1 or 2 nights, tops. After the paparazzi incident, the cabin didn't feel safe anymore. They'd somehow found him, even here in Maple Hollow, where the loudest thing most mornings was the postman's engine sputtering up the hill. He didn't hesitate when I offered my house. Just grabbed his duffel and followed me inside. "I'll take the couch," he said before I even finished unlocking the front door. It wasn't a big place. Open kitchen, narrow hallway, a single bedroom. The couch was barely long enough for him to stretch out. But he didn't complain. Not once. He just made himself small. And somehow made my home feel big again. The first night, I lay in bed with the door cracked open, listening. I told myself I was just being cautious. That I was only making sure he was okay. But that was a lie, wasn't it? I wanted to hear the sound of him shifting in the dark. The soft huff of his breath when he finally fell asleep. The little sigh he made when he turned on his side. The second night he cooked. "You really gonna judge my eggs?" he asked, flipping them too early just to piss me off. I didn't. I just laughed and made coffee, and it felt like we were something almost domestic. By the 4th night, I noticed the way he said goodnight. Like it meant more than the word aloud. Like he didn't want the night to end. Neither did I. And God help me, by the 5th I was counting the hours until I could hear it again. "Good night, Lawrence." He said it low, soft, like a secret. And every time, it made my skin burn. It wasn't about fame. Or the scandal. Or even the intimacy of sharing a roof. It was him. Alexander. The man who filled rooms without trying. Who looked like the world owed him something but never bothered to collect. He was impossible not to want. The kind of impossible that kept you awake long after the lights were out. One night, I walked into the kitchen and found him in nothing but a pair of sweatpants, shirtless, damp from the shower. He didn't move when he saw me. Just leaned against the counter and said, "Can't sleep either?" And all I could do was shake my head, because the truth was, I hadn't slept properly since he moved in. "Want tea?" he offered, turning without waiting for an answer. I watched the muscles in his back move as he filled the kettle. And I hated myself for noticing. For wanting. "I'm not good at this," he said after a while. "At what?" "Being close to people. I always wreck it." I leaned on the opposite side of the counter, trying to keep the distance safe. "Maybe you just haven't been close to the right people." He looked up then. Really looked at me. And that was the moment it changed. Something in the air shifted, thickened. Like gravity had pulled tighter between us. Neither of us moved. The kettle whistled, loud and shrill, but no one reached for it. "I should go to bed," he said, voice hoarse. "Yeah," I murmured. "Me too." But neither of us moved. Not right away. Because we both knew, deep down, that something was already happening. And I wasn't supposed to want him. But I did. It wasn't planned. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. It rained the way it only does in small towns, slow, persistent, tapping at every surface like it was trying to be let in. The lake blurred into mist. The roads disappeared behind a curtain of water. And in my house, everything was still. I'd spent most of the day avoiding him. Not because I was angry, because I was afraid. Afraid of what I'd say. Afraid of what I wouldn't be able to take back. But around 9 p.m., I walked into the living room and found him standing by the window, arms folded, face unreadable. Just watching the rain. Like it held answers he'd been chasing his whole life. "I can't keep doing this," I said. He didn't move. Didn't blink. Just said quietly, "Doing what?" "Pretending this doesn't kill me a little more every day." Turn then. Slowly. Carefully. Like he was afraid I might vanish. "What do you want from me, Lawrence?" "You." The word came out like a confession and a plea all at once. Not the actor. Not the scandal. You. And there was silence. It stretched between us like a tightrope, and I didn't know if either of us would dare walk it. Then he stepped forward. One step. Two. Until he was right in front of me, his chest rising and falling, his breath warm against my face. "Say it again," he whispered. "I want you." He closed his eyes for a beat, like it hurt to hear it. Then he opened them, and there was no hesitation left. No mask. No performance. He kissed me. Desperate. Like he'd been holding his breath for years, and I was the only thing that could make him breathe again. My hands found his shoulders. His fingers tangled in my shirt. We weren't gentle. We weren't careful. We were real. The world didn't spin. It didn't explode. It went silent. Like even time knew not to interrupt us. And when we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, both of us gasping for air that suddenly felt new. "I've wanted this," he said, voice shaking. "Since the first morning. Since the coffee. Since the eggs." I laughed, choked on it really. "You're terrible at eggs." He grinned. "Guess you'll have to teach me." He pulled me in again, slower this time, and I let myself melt into him. The storm raged outside. But inside we found quiet. We were good at hiding. Until we weren't. It started with a knock on the door. Not loud. Not urgent. But it cracked the air like thunder. I opened it to find a man with a camera slung around his neck, eyes slick with that hungry look I knew too well. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. By the time I slammed the door shut, I already knew. Someone had seen us. It was all over the internet by morning. A blurry photo of two men kissing on a porch too ordinary to be famous, except one of them was. The caption read like a gunshot, "Alexander Knight's secret lover revealed," followed by subheadings that dissected my house, my face, my name. They found my job, my Instagram, my past. And him? The headlines carved into him like knives. Fallen star. Hollywood's golden boy exposed. Career suicide or scandalous romance? He paced the hallway like an animal caught in a cage that once felt like home. His hand shook. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. His manager called 5 times in an hour. His publicist sent a statement to approve. His ex made a post that dripped with faux concern and hidden venom. And through it all I just stood there, watching the man I'd fallen for disappear. Because that's what was happening. He wasn't Alex anymore. He was Alexander Knight again, the man who smiled on red carpets. The man who knew how to lie with his teeth. The man who was expected to be someone else. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, voice raw. "I know," I whispered. "This could ruin you." I stepped closer, wanting to reach for him, hold him, remind him that I wasn't scared. But he stepped back. "Maybe it's better if I leave," he added. Just until it blows over. The words hit harder than I expected. You think it'll blow over? I don't know. His jaw tightened. But I can't stay here and watch them tear you apart too. You're not protecting me, I said. You're protecting yourself. Again. That landed like a slap. He looked at me then, really looked. His eyes were haunted. Tired. Torn between the life he had and the love he wanted. I never asked for any of this, he said. I nodded. Neither did I. Silence. Then, without another word, he walked to the door. Didn't look back. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after it shut. The place felt hollow. Like he'd taken the sound with him. I thought loving him would be the hardest part. But I was wrong. Letting him go was. He said it was safer for me if he disappeared. But he left everything behind, except his heart. The note was simple. Straightforward. Nothing poetic, nothing dramatic, just a few words scrawled hastily, as though he couldn't bring himself to leave more than the bare minimum. I'm sorry. You deserve better. This isn't over. Just not now. I'll always be with you. I read it 3 times before I could swallow the lump in my throat. He was gone. Gone, and yet, he was everywhere. The absence of him was louder than his presence had ever been. It was the silence that clung to the house, like dust in the corners of every room. I couldn't shake it off. Every corner I turned felt like I was walking into a ghost. The table where we'd had breakfast together. The porch swing where he'd sat for hours, staring out at the lake. The bed where he had pressed his body against mine, and for a few brief moments, nothing else mattered. I walked through the house like I was a stranger in my own skin. The lake outside, once peaceful and serene, now seemed cold and detached the way I felt. The sound of the water slapping against the shore had turned hollow. His absence had stretched the space between us further than I could ever bridge. But it wasn't just the empty spaces that haunted me. It was his things. His shirt still hung in my closet, a faded navy blue button-down that he'd left behind one night when he'd changed into something more comfortable. I hadn't been able to bring myself to take it down. I ran my fingers over the fabric every time I opened the door, tracing the lines of the sleeves like I could feel him there. Like I could pull him back into my life. I tried to ignore it. I tried to move on, to go back to my routine. But every day felt like dragging my feet through mud. I couldn't get the image of him out of my head. His laugh. His touch. His eyes so full of contradictions. One moment he was a lover, the next a stranger, and through it all, I could never quite tell if he was ever truly mine to begin with. But it wasn't just the shirt. It was the way he'd left, like I was never going to hear from him again. I had known it was coming. I'd known that loving him would be dangerous, would have consequences neither of us were prepared for. But that didn't mean I was ready for it. I spent my days trying to make sense of the mess he'd left behind. Not just physically, but emotionally too. There were moments when I could almost hear his voice, his steady, calm tone, as if he were still here. But then reality would break through, and the absence would hit me harder than anything. I couldn't go back to the man I had been before he came. The quiet, solitary life I'd crafted for myself seemed unbearable now. Before, I had been content with solitude, with the silence that filled the spaces around me. But now, even the silence felt loud, screaming at me in a way that didn't make sense. I was supposed to feel relieved. I was supposed to be thankful that he was gone, that the chaos he'd brought into my life was over. But I didn't feel free. I felt empty. Like a part of me had been ripped out, and no matter how hard I tried to fill it, nothing would work. The lake was still there, always there, but it didn't comfort me anymore. The water seemed darker now, colder than it had ever been before. And every time I went outside, I swore I could still smell him. His cologne, faint but unmistakable, clung to the air like a memory I couldn't escape. I should have thrown his shirt away. Should have put everything he left behind in a box and buried it in the back of my closet. But I couldn't. Because it wasn't just the shirt. It was him. It was the way he'd made me feel, the way he'd filled the spaces of my life with something I didn't know I was missing. He had left. But he hadn't really gone anywhere. Not in my heart. I knew the world wouldn't stop spinning. Maple Hollow would go on. But the truth was, I didn't know how to live without him anymore. And that, more than anything else, terrified me. Would I ever be able to go back to the life I had before he arrived? I didn't think so. The media made me the villain. The teacher who seduced a broken star. But they didn't see the nights. The silence. The love. I had never imagined a life where my name was synonymous with scandal, where the world would look at me and see nothing but an embarrassing mistake. But that was exactly what happened when the photos hit the tabloids. The blurred, intimate image of us on the back porch, his lips on mine, a moment of passion caught without consent, had ignited a firestorm. The media had no interest in understanding the context. They didn't care that it wasn't just a kiss, it was a confession. A confession of everything I had been holding inside, everything we had built together, in secret. But no one cared about that. All they saw was a teacher who had taken advantage of a broken man. They painted me as the predator, the manipulator, the one who had used Alexander's vulnerability for my own gain. They turned our love into a headline, dissecting it like a story to be consumed, chewed up, and spit out. The worst part wasn't the accusations. It wasn't even the whispers I overheard as I walked through town. It was the way people looked at me now, like I was a villain in my own life. I would walk into the diner, and the chatter would stop. People who used to greet me with a smile would glance away, eyes filled with judgment, as though my very presence was a reminder of something shameful. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the truth. The truth of what we had shared, the truth of the connection we had formed. It wasn't about fame or scandal. It wasn't about what the world thought of us. It was about the nights we spent talking about nothing and everything. It was about the way he would look at me, as if I were the only person who truly understood him. And it was about the love that had grown in the silence between us, in the spaces where no one else could reach. In the midst of it all, I found myself torn between the desire to protect him and the need to protect myself. The whispers, the accusations, they were suffocating. But Alexander? He had already been suffocated by the weight of the world. He'd lived under the microscope for so long, and I wasn't about to let the media destroy what little was left of him. Reporters came knocking on my door. They hounded me at work. My job was at risk. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me as they camped outside, waiting for me to slip, waiting for me to make a mistake they could blow up into something ugly. They were relentless, asking me questions I didn't have the answers to, trying to bait me into saying something that would make the headlines. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about the story. I stood my ground. Every time a camera flashed in my face, every time they asked if I regretted what I had done, I refused to answer. They wanted me to apologize. They wanted me to backtrack, to say that it wasn't real, that it had been a mistake, but I couldn't. I wouldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't regret him. I didn't regret any of it. Not the kiss, not the love, not the moments we had shared. I wasn't going to let the world tell me what to feel or who I was allowed to love. I wasn't going to let their judgment define me. And when the headlines painted me as the villain, the one who had seduced him, I held my head high. I wasn't going to let them make me feel small, not when I knew what we had was real. The media didn't understand. They didn't see the nights we spent awake, talking about the things we had lost, the things we still dreamed of. They didn't see how he had looked at me in the quiet moments, eyes filled with something deeper than lust. They didn't know about the way we had healed together, how we had found solace in each other's arms. But none of that mattered to them. They had their narrative, and they weren't interested in the truth. Still, I didn't regret it. I couldn't. Because Alexander Knight, broken, imperfect, and beautiful, was more than the sum of the mistakes they said we'd made. He was everything I had ever wanted and more. And even though the world might see me as his mistake, I knew better. I knew that I had never made a mistake by loving him. And if the world couldn't see that, then that was their problem, not mine. Fame had taken so much from him. But this time, he chose to give me something back, his truth. It was an ordinary Tuesday. The kind of morning where the sun poked through the clouds just enough to make you believe the day might not be so bad. I was teaching, nothing out of the ordinary. Notes scribbled across the whiteboard, students murmuring, half paying attention, the steady hum of the classroom. Then, without warning, my world tilted. I saw him. Through the window just outside the door. He was standing there, as if the storm of his life had cleared, the weight of it finally shifting from his shoulders. Alexander. I froze. I thought I was imagining it. My heart started to pound in my chest, a rush of adrenaline flooding me. Was it really him? Was I dreaming? But then he moved, slowly, deliberately, and I knew. He was here. And he wasn't hiding anymore. His tall frame was leaning against the hallway wall, his hand casually holding a single sunflower. Not a bouquet, just one. It looked almost out of place in his hands, like something meant for a garden, not the press tours, the cameras, or the millions of eyes that had watched his every move for years. But there he was, standing there like he had nothing to prove. My breath caught in my throat. For a second, the world outside the window, the chatter, the passing of time, faded away. It was just me and him, separated by the glass, but it felt like there was no distance at all. He saw me. There was no hesitation. His gaze met mine, and I watched as he took a deep breath, the kind of breath someone takes when they're ready to change everything. The moment he stepped toward the door, I knew this was it. This wasn't the same man who had run away in the night, the man who had disappeared without a word. This was someone different, someone who had come back with purpose. The door opened, and the classroom fell silent. I didn't even hear the students anymore. It was just his presence, taking up space in the room. His eyes locked with mine, raw and intense. He didn't speak at first. The weight of everything unsaid hung between us, the history of the chaos, the media, the lies. But he didn't need to say anything. I could feel it. I could feel that he was finally ready to give me what he hadn't been able to before. His truth. Hey, he said, his voice low, but there was no hesitation. No mask. Just him. I stood up slowly, unsure of what to do, my hands instinctively reaching for the edge of the desk. My heart hammered in my chest, as if my body was betraying me, a mix of excitement and fear. What are you? My voice faltered, the question lost in the air. How could I even begin to ask? What had changed? Why was he here? What did it all mean? I'm not hiding anymore, he said, his voice steady, but there was an underlying tenderness that sent a shock through me. He took a step closer, his hand outstretched, offering the sunflower. No more running, Lawrence. Not from you. Not from anyone. For a moment, the world stood still. I felt a swell of emotion, something so raw and powerful that it nearly brought tears to my eyes. This was what I had always wanted, the truth, the honesty, the piece of him that had always been missing. I reached out, taking the flower from him, the softness of its petals grounding me in the moment. I had imagined this moment so many times, fantasized about what it would be like, but now that it was real, I couldn't process it. There was no way to prepare for this kind of return, no way to know how to react when everything you thought you'd lost is suddenly standing before you, offering you something so real, so vulnerable, that it made your heart ache. He stepped closer, and I could smell him, fresh, earthy, like the rain that had followed him through all his struggles. There was no celebrity aura around him anymore, no shiny exterior. He was just Alexander, standing in front of me, the man who had walked away but was now choosing to come back. I've spent so much time hiding from who I am, he continued, his eyes not leaving mine. Hiding from what I want, what I feel. And I realized, I don't want to hide from you anymore. Not from anyone. My hands trembled slightly as I held the sunflower, but I didn't care. I felt something shift inside me, like a door opening to a part of me I had kept closed for so long. This was the man I had fallen for, the man who had spent so long running from everything, from himself, from us. But now he was here. He was choosing me. Why now? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His smile was small, but it carried all the weight of what had come before. Because I'm tired of pretending, he said softly. And I'm tired of letting fear control my life. I'm tired of hiding from the truth. And in that moment, everything changed. There were no more secrets between us. No more questions that would go unanswered. He was standing there, completely open, offering me everything he had been holding back for so long. I walked toward him slowly, almost cautiously, like the floor beneath us might give way if I moved too quickly. But I couldn't stop myself. I didn't want to. When I was close enough, I could feel the heat radiating from him, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and I knew. This wasn't just about a kiss, or a love that had been forced into hiding by the world. This was about us, about choosing to stop surviving in the shadows and start living in the light. As I reached out to touch his arm, something deep inside me settled. This wasn't just a reunion, it was a rebirth. It was the beginning of something new, something real. No more hiding, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. And as I looked into his eyes, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't hiding either. We were finally free.